Okay, thank you for this question. I have to admit, maybe start with a disclaimer at the beginning that I have not studied AI, so I'm not really a kind of a particular specialist on the topic. I do think about AI because AI comes as the next promise that is very similar to the promises we have seen with biometrics, for example, or other technologies. Because we are in an age where technology evolves so quickly, we see that the same problems, rather than being addressed on their own terms, continue to be dissolved to new technologies. So you try to solve a problem with biometrics, and then you see it doesn't really solve the problem. So you try platforms, and then you have platforms in place, and you see, they have weaknesses. They do some things. They are effective in the world, but at the same time, they don't really solve their problems. So now, kind of, you're thinking about how can AI help me? Because I'm more a scholar of governance these days, and have not been thinking so much about how these digital tools are used in democratic processes or for elections. What I have to say is more about governance, and about how people use them in order to solve problems of distribution, welfare, attendance mechanisms. And you see that, lots of the social problems that we had before, they persist in different new configurations or new dispensations. And there is an optimism of technology, and that optimism has to do less with the efficacy of this technology in solving these problems, but in the fact there's always a new technology you can put your hope into, so that you're racing from one technology to the other, kind of hoping that you'll have the perfect world, to find yourself every time disillusioned. You're in the normal world with all of these injustices, power balances, and you have to rework them again and again, in the new techno environments. I'm very critical of Foucault's approach, or the way Foucault's approach is being kind of used in order to understand contemporary governance, because I find that when you speak about biopolitics in a Foucauldian notion, it focuses very much on the center of power, intentions that are maybe formulated at this, in this site. And there's the belief that they are refracted through these tools, and then dissipated into society to discipline citizens, in the way they're acting. But when you look at kind of power in the work on Foucault, you will find that he has a very differentiated view of power being something that is dispersed in society, exercised in all relationships. Now, when we kind of live in these network societies as we're living today, the space in which power manifests is constantly expanding. And this answers to the question, are we facing a very specific situation in, for example, South Asia, or in kind of other countries or regions of the global South, or are we witnessing the same in Euro-America as we are witnessing across the world? So I think there are distinctions, but they're entangled in new ways, and they're entangled in new ways not only because institutions travel, not only because technologies travels, but also the way people imagine to be using these technologies, they travel along with them. So that, kind of while any tool could be kind of put to multiple uses, there are manufactured and standard ways that people think about these tools. And it is interesting when they divert from these intentions and do new things, which is but a rare occasion. right? Because usually comes a whole pedagogy with what this tool is supposed to do. And this, of course, has to do with the division of labor, where the programming, the manufacturing, the using, the purposing of these technologies happens in different areas of the world, so that no one has the skill mostly kind of to do all of these things, right? So there's only kind of limited creativity that you can program into these devices. Are they kind of being used for Foucauldian biopolitical projects? I think if we want to understand Foucauldian biopolitical projects, we need to think much more of the network character of, kind of how it plays out in these extended networks. And some of my work speaks to the way the agency of the machines plays into these relationships. And in fact, crosscuts kind of some of the intentions, but also some of the traditions. Now, what has been interesting for me in the South Asian context, where kind of lots of social relations get organized along and lots of discriminations also get organized along lines of caste, class, region, language. With biometric machines, for example, they discriminate against some people and not against others. But the way they do it kind of does not necessarily fit into your intersectional discriminations, while there's a tendency that poor people kind of, are more disadvantaged because, for many reasons, that they, the way they are kind of situated in their lives. Middle class people similarly kind of will face challenges when they kind of, have to now fracture their lives kind of through these machines that need to see them, need to authorize them. So in some way, unless we factor this in, I think we were never going to kind of understand fully how these things socially function or the effects they have. And for this reason, I think we need to think beyond centralizing ideas of power in order to better understand what are the real kind of life effects of these technologies. Thank you for this question. This is a fantastic question, also because it goes back to some of my older work, which I feel very passionate about. And my answer starts with a little story about how I started studying journalists. I had no intention of studying journalists. I had the intention of studying politics and political dynamics, and I wanted to study democratic institutions. And I was struck when I did that in Lucknow, how prominent journalists were in these circles, how not only they were seemingly present everywhere all the time, but how much they gave direction to the discourses that people were having. They were kind of asking the questions, they were setting agendas, they were kind of, directing attention. And in some way, I felt that their work was crucial to the political discourse. It's not the only dominating factor that shapes how politicians kind of work, what they think about, what they talk about, but it actually has much more of an impact than at least I thought at that time, when I thought they are reporters. So they go, receive the news of what anyone has to say and then report about it. But in fact, I found them to be much more producers of news that were produced by them setting agendas to which the politicians then had to position themselves. And for me, this was a significant finding because it shows how some of this agenda setting is not just happening by what media publish, but what already kind of, becomes the type of topics people speak about in these conversations. And since, media, people who kind of work with media are so omnipresent, they have a kind of a good input on this. And so I think if one wants to study media today and its impact on the political sphere, I think one needs to pay attention to this, because the simple fact that everything you could say at any time can be picked up by anyone. So it's not only that you have to watch yourself in these conversations with journalists, and see like, what are you saying? How are you responding? How you are also maybe, sometimes journalists would field a topic, which a politician really didn't have anything to say about or didn't want to speak about, and yet they had to, because there was a whole group of them kind of pushing them to say something. So you had to become conversant in speaking about things that you maybe don't want to speak about, and that you don't want to publicize, or that you don't want to be known about. And this is kind of changing very radically now that everyone could be potentially a journalist, everyone could post things, everyone could tweet things, everything could be on the media, anytime your voice could be recorded. So the fact that public agenda setting is much less in the hand of certain professionals, I think has a profound impact on democracy, which we are not yet understanding. And so getting before the media, as opposed to reporting only about what's in the media, but the conversations and the habitus and the readiness and the style of speaking and the way it changes because people are conscious of the environment in which they are, I think we need much more work on this, which we don't even begin to understand. Thank you for this question. So one of the things that has interested me when I did the study on tempers is I've gone through a very classical education where I kind of learned from Indologists, religious studies scholars, very learned people about kind of the various religious tradition. And we were still in a time where practice theory was only just kind of beginning to influence the way scholars were writing. So that much of it still came in this form of thinking that we're dealing with structures and durabilities. And I found that when I started my study on the temple, that people had such institutions, they had traditions, they had cultural memories, and they would in fact also project them forward. But I was always interested in how things as they manifest in the real are different from the stereotypical notion of what this actually should be. Like, women are not like what one says women are, what they are like in South Asia. Rituals are not quite, as, you learn in the school book, what they would be like. And so I was looking at the space in between the idealized institution and the actual practice, which is kind of a classical anthropological move to make. And so, for example, you're sitting in a ritual. For this ritual, the Kartiks, which is the caste I was working with at that time, have invited a Brahmin, because that would kind of give them, elevate the status of their community, but also of their temple. But then they're not willing to follow the instructions the Brahmin gives, right? They say, oh, but we want the ritual slightly different. Here you don't use this substance, but we, kind of substitute with something else. And then you have, in the course of a ritual, which I learned in my undergraduate years, that is very stereotypical, will be repeated in the same way every time. You have kind of ongoing negotiations about what you're doing now and what's the correct thing to do and what not. And then there's a discourse around it, and once it is finished and everyone is settled, we're doing the right thing, but we may be doing something different than what the Brahmin thought was the right thing. Similarly, you have all of these exceptions. Yes, this is a ritual only for men. Women can't participate, but if women participate with their husbands, then it's okay. Because they wanted to kind of bring women, be modern, And this is where the urban comes in. In the urban context, you need to update this because women are not willing, to be relegated maybe to the second spot. So you're trying to bring women in and you're finding, some kind of argument. So then I was there, my husband was not there. I wanted to participate. The question is, can they facilitate it? And then they wanted to facilitate it, so they married me to a coconut, and then I participated with my coconut husband. And so, so what you see is kind of the stretchability of these institutions, but also, at what point, then the community is saying, no, but this is no longer valid, because that also happens, right? You can't do anything with institutions. So clearly these institutions are malleable, and their flexibility accounts for the way change happens. For example, that women can do more things now than they kind of used to do earlier. But, this is not, endlessly stretchable. And as people negotiate, these boundaries, kind of overstep them, then be called back, or maybe kind of they can, push it through and push against kind of, some of the kind of conservative forces. And this is something that always interests me. And it is already there in some way in this book, but I think it is in all of my work. And I found through the course of my career that, because my own vocabulary expands, that some of these things I can describe better today than I could when I was a graduate student, trying to finish my PhD. So I think this is very important because it helps us understand cultural change. And I think we need a theory of cultural change. Or what I would say today, we need a theory of cultural changing. So I'm trying to observe how changing is happening as opposed to how cultural change has happened. Thank you. So what you're pointing to is very important, that I think policy in itself is not effective in the world, but policy in an adapted form, can have also positive effects in this world. So in other words, you cannot think theoretically about a problem and you cannot solve it theoretically, but you can only solve it practically. But if you are in the moment of the practice, you don't necessarily have a meta view of the problem, so that you can't solve it just by tinkering. You also can't solve it by abstract policy. Abstract policy has the advantage that you can think about complexity of the scenario. You have the different stakeholders, what they want, what are the different needs, how much money do you have to do this, what are your institutional bodies that are supposed to implement this. But you're thinking this only in the abstract, as if these various stakeholders were all stereotypical persons, as if institutions would work the way we imagine them as ideally existing. So when then kind of policy meets practice, it does need this adaptation. Now, one of the things that I am observing in my current work, and which is in some way is kind of relevant also for resettlement, and it's relevant for any policy, this is that the more a policy will be kind of learning and adapting as a system, not just individual tinkering, right? You have kind of either those policy workers who kind of try to design the best policies, and they are, the tinkering in the everyday, that makes this happen. But really what needs to happen is, such tinkering needs to be reflected back into the system, and then kind of, allow structural change to happen. The problem with such change is that when we imagine it as linear, as kind of always policy becoming better, I think we are really naive, because the inefficiencies, problems, and conflicts that are inherent in the implementation of policy have to do a lot with positionality. Different people find different things bad, dysfunctional, not working, not for them, dislikable, and they will all kind of feed their viewpoint back into the system. Now, if you listen to all of this, there's kind of much more than you can act on. Moreover, you will find that some stakeholders push you in that direction and other stakeholders want you to go in this direction, right? The question then is like, whom are you listening to? And policy always listens, and it always adapts. But the question is, how is it adapting? And I call this the drift of policy. The drift of policy is that, in fact, it starts with an intention. And then as you're learning, you're getting better, it gets better, but it doesn't necessarily get better in producing the effects that you want. But maybe it gets kind of very good at, kind of doing something else in the world, and you're really happy about this. But you've forgotten or you're not able to solve some of the problems that you initially kind of hoped you would be solving. So you have to start with a new policy that will kind of address this problem again. So in my talk in the afternoon, I will kind of speak about drift of policy, because I think that this recursive learning is absolutely necessary, but I don't think it makes policy per se better. It makes it different, but it does make it effective in the world, whereas policy that doesn't adapt is just basically dysfunctional. It doesn't work because you can't, in theory, solve a problem. A problem has to be solved on the ground. Yeah, I think this is a fantastic question because it shows us that a policy is never just one intention. It has several intentions, and some of them are explicit and some of them are implicit in it, but they kind of, only become, reveal itself in the practice that, well, we wanted this policy also because we can report to the World Bank about kind of development goals. But then maybe you are not actually having the data that you can report, so you need to tweak your policy to produce that kind of data. So, I mean, there are implicit goals, there are explicit goals, there are different goals. And, that in itself already kind of, creates the complexity of a policy. And some of them kind of will be more realistic and others less so. And very often, your policy will then, kind of be in the world in a very different way that you initially thought. And, although kind of kind of maybe implement what you wanted, it doesn't necessarily, kind of speak to the whole set of different goals that you had. Yes and no. I mean, at some level, I think we have to accept that we live in an imperfect world. And it's the job of anthropologists not so much to come up with pat solutions, but to show kind of what are underlying conflicts, that kind of create the difficulties that manifest in the world again and again and again. So I think rather than being naive and believing, that, kind of all it needs is better policy, and then, we have best practices, and with that we can solve every problem, then you have to realize that, kind of this is, I think maybe one can bring an example from medicine. I think we've all accepted that, if you use a particular kind of substance to cure an illness, it will work for some, it will not work for others. It will be detrimental to some, it will be less so for others. It will maybe solve the problem for a certain time, but then maybe bacteria or your viruses are evolving and your antibiotic, for example, doesn't work anymore, right? Because the ecology has changed. So everything about human life is complex. Everything about ecologies is complex. Solutions, any form of modernist solutions, whether they're policies, whether they're medicine, whether they're any other form of solutions, will always be generated through very simple abstractions, right? And an abstraction is always what it is, an abstraction. And an abstraction cannot kind of be the same thing when it's in the world. So in other words, you can't, say I have this problem and then I'm giving you an abstraction and you solve the problem. right? So we need to be much more realistic about, when can this policy do something positive and when is it maybe negative, because if we believe that the policy is to be applied anytime and all the time, you have, Weber's iron cage. Then there's no discretion, there's no moving, there's also no recognizing that, now this policy or policy in itself maybe not the right way to go. Maybe we need people to be empowered. Maybe we need to help people kind of to speak for themselves as opposed to policymakers kind of, speaking for them. So I think we need to be much more aware of the limits of governability or the limits of policy in order to be able to use them to the kind of degree that they're useful. Just like, we are very kind of conscious that, kind of the medical system has strengths and weaknesses. No one is saying kind of dismiss it, don't use kind of modern medicine anymore, but everyone knows there are some illnesses, it will not help. Similarly, policy is just like that. We should end this fantasy that if only we have the right policy, then we don't have social problems. That is just not the case. We need a kind of a more sensitive kind of articulation of, what policy can do for whom at what time. And then kind of it will be more beneficial for more people. So this, in fact, is a surprise to me. A topic found me as opposed to me finding a topic, because mostly kind of during my life I decided now I'm doing this. But just as I wanted to work on politics and ended up working on journalists, I'm finding that I was working on e-governance, but I'm now currently writing this book on the health insurance, which in fact kind of brings me deep into reflections on health. What is health? What is good health? What is it, for people who have, who are marginalized and who have less resources? And so that the book, which I thought was a book about e-governance, turns out to be a book about kind of healthcare refractured through e-governance. And I think that, as much as this is going to be a book, I think, in the field of medical anthropology as much as in, digital studies. I think that I'm not yet done with health and healthcare and thinking about it and the institutions of healthcare. I'm fascinated by it also because as we're starting to think about planetary health, what is it to be healthy? Not just for humans to be healthy, but to be in healthy environments and to care for the health of not just human beings, but also, a more than human world. So my work is likely to expand into this direction of kind of health, ecology, and the more than human world.